Okay, so now we're on to setting the budget. We had already just done objective setting, and now we'll do the budget determination. And before we begin, I'll just start with a quote. I know that half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The problem is I don't know which half. That was said by John Wanamaker, a kind of retail industrial icon in America, I think in about the late 1800s, early 1900s. So the question is advertising an expense or an investment? And the answer is, as usual, it depends. And here it depends on how you look at it and who you ask. Of course, advertising is an expense. It's a cost. It, is recorded in the P&L statement. It comes out of your, profits. I mean, it's a cost and has a, in your profit calculation. So, it's also an investment, though. It has to be seen as potentially a necessary investment, just like any piece of productive assets that you have, like some equipment to produce something to sell. Without doing advertising, a business can fail because it doesn't have enough awareness or people don't trust the brand. And, the sales may not come without having done some level of advertising. So it's kind of like an investment as well. And it depends on who you ask because a lot of, small business owners in particular, where, they see advertising as only an expense and uh, they are very reluctant to give money, that they don't think that they have. And every dollar or lira that comes out of their pocket is seen as like, something bad. But, oftentimes it's a necessary investment. Another question is, well, is it a good investment? And that's a more difficult question to answer because it depends on how it is used. If it's used well, and if it's, the advertising is properly targeted and, the objectives are well done and the message strategy is correct, and also the other aspects of the marketing program are done right, like the product is good, the quality is good, the price is right, the distribution level is high enough to support the sales, then it can be a good investment and you can get a good return on investment. But if those things are not in place, then advertising can be a waste of money. Imagine if you're not having high enough distribution, right? And you do a big advertising campaign, spend a lot of money, but the product is not available in the stores, or the product has some quality issues to it, and people buy it and they don't want to repurchase it, or the price is too high. So it depends on how it is used. So let's look at some approaches to setting the budget. First of all, arbitrary allocation. This is not really some kind of a method that we would teach, but it's um, a method that's widely used nonetheless. Arbitrary means kind of random, without any kind of logic to support it. So this is basically saying, which a lot of business, small business owners especially do. They don't know how much money to give, so they just pick a number. Well, this is what, how much we're just going to put for our advertising budget. But that's obviously not a very good approach. It's not sophisticated, and I just bring it up. I talk about it now just as a more as an example of what not to do. There's also the affordable approach, which is again something that lots of small businesses do. It's basically saying, um, what money is left over after all the other expenses are paid, after salaries and rent and whatever. If we have any money left over, that's what we're going to put into it. And it's also kind of like the ultimate reality check, because if companies don't set aside money specifically for advertising, and they may want to do advertising, but if they don't have any kind of money left over to put into it, then it's, they can't do it. So it's kind of like a check on what they're capable of doing. And this is also not the best method, right? If we think that advertising is an investment, then we should try to, have enough money, allocate enough money, make sure there is enough money that we allocate for advertising, and treat it like an investment. There's also another approach called marginal analysis, and I'll walk you through that here on this graph. The straight red line is the total advertising and promotion expenditures. Okay, so you have a fixed cost at the beginning, and it ramps up. And the question is, well, how much money should we spend on advertising? How much, how big should the budget be? And the answer is that with marginal analysis, we want the marginal revenue to equal marginal cost. At that point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that is the point at which we stop, we say that, we cut the budget. At that point where the marginal revenue and the marginal costs are equal, where the dotted line crosses the dotted red line crosses the solid red line, at that point, profit is zero, right? So once that profit, incremental profit, I should say, the marginal profit becomes zero, then that means we've maximized the total profit, the area under the curved solid blue line at the bottom. The area under there is the, maximum profit that we can get. So the idea here is that you keep advertising until sales continue going up, and then sales are going to kind of level off. You can see that the dotted blue line at the top levels off. And then at that point, adding an extra dollar of advertising expenditure isn't contributing anything to profit, right? In fact, it is actually going to reduce profit. You have negative marginal profits. So the idea there is just keep adding, extra money until marginal return, marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. So the problem here, though, is that this is a very difficult, it's very difficult to see the effect on sales. The assumptions underlying this approach are that sales are a direct result of advertising and that they're a perfect measure of advertising. But we know that that's not the case. Many different things affect sales, and sometimes we don't see the effect of advertising on sales directly or quickly. So this is like an approach that requires lots of sophistication and immediate, kind of feedback, a lot of information. And so the logic of it is good, and you should take that to heart. But putting it into practice exactly like this as a budget setting method is a bit difficult. But the idea of just, putting money into the budget up until sales are affected positively, but don't put too much money in where, you're kind of throwing, too much money at it, and the sales are kind of leveling off. You're not going to see an added return on investment at that point. Perhaps the most widely used approach in big business is the percentage of sales method, where companies will just say, well, what's our expected revenues, our expected levels of sales for the next year? What's our annual revenue going to be? And we take a percent of that revenue and devote it to sales. And this is good because lots of, industries, there's lots of information about industry averages how much is an industry average percent of sales? How much do different companies within an industry spend on sales? And you can see that here. For example, wine, brandy, and brandy spirits, about halfway down, they spend about 11.8% of sales, right? That's the most in this table. Second most is food and kindred products, the fourth one down, 11.3%. So you can see that these are published, in trade magazines or by government, and you can get a kind of a rough estimate of how much you should be spending on sales. Clothing, 8.4% of sales. But this is also not an entirely, I don't want to say accurate, but it's not the best way to budget for advertising, because here we're saying then, depending upon what our level of sales is, that's how much money we put into the advertising budget. But it kind of reverses the logic of advertising, right? We're supposed to say, well, we put money into advertising to increase our sales. So if sales are low, like let's say last year we had low sales, we did $1 million in sales, so we're only going to put 10% of that budget into the sales for next year. But that means that we may limit our revenue, like we may not have an impact on the sales. We may not, for example, if we spend more, maybe our revenue would be even higher, right? So this actually reverses the logic of the advertising and sales relationship. It's kind of, you know, illogical, let's say. It's often done, but it's widely used. It's simple, but it's not really the best approach either. Uh, and also just think that if you are, okay, one way to say, well, to improve upon this is to say, well, what's our projected revenue for next year? And let's try to match that, as a percentage of sales, we'll match the advertising budget to that. But then what happens is, like in your first or second quarter, if you're not meeting your sales targets, if the sales are not that high, then the budget gets reduced. And that's actually almost the opposite of, or it is the opposite of what you would want to do. If sales are not, reaching the level you want them to, you don't want to pull back your advertising budget, right? Because that would pretty much make your sales go down even farther. But again, this is a widely used method. And then there's the competitive parity. This is the share of voice approach. It just says, what's the competition doing? You want to, if the competitors are spending this much, and they have this much market share, well, you want to spend as much as they are to get that level of market share. Or if you're, lower level of market share, then you spend a little bit less than the competitors. It's like you basically adjust your budget to have this share of voice that, if whoever speaks the loudest, right? You're putting the most budget behind the advertising campaign, and they're going to speak the loudest. They're going to be the ones that are heard the most, and they're going to get the most market share, is basically the logic. And I had lots of, real data to show you from, old companies that I worked for, but I don't want to show that in public, because I think it's kind of, proprietary or private data. So I won't show you those tables that show you like this share of voice, because the companies that do advertising, media companies, they will provide you with share of voice uh, estimates, how much is being spent in each category by each company. Oh, actually there it is right there. I don't want to show that, so I'm going to pause this right now. That was supposed to be a hidden slide. So let me just pause this, and we'll come back and I'll hide the slides and we'll go forward again.